Well, good morning, everyone. We're glad you're here. My name's Aaron. I'm one of our pastors, and whether you are in Odenton or Annapolis in the chapel in the auditorium, or very excited, or not excited at all, we're glad you're with us this morning. Thank you for being here. And I know it's January, which means it's a new year, and a lot of people, they like to do a lot of goal setting and looking forward, and that's great. But if I'm honest, in many ways, for my personality, looking forward is, on average, much too stressful for me. I don't do a lot of that, and it might be silly, but what I normally do in January, all I can really stomach typically is to look back on the last year. That's about all I can do. I just want to look back, because if I set too many goals, for me, it just feels like by the time March hits, I'm like, nothing I thought was important in January is still important anymore somehow. So I try to look back and just, instead be overwhelmed by how much happened in the last 12 months, as opposed to what I expect will happen in the next. But I don't know if you've ever had this experience, but you look back and you say, at least for me, I was just doing this recently over the past week and going like, wait, did that happen like just this past September? Like 3 or 4 months ago? Like, is that when that thing that I'm thinking about just happened? Because you could convince me that this past September was in 2013. You know what I mean? Like, I'm not sure that I have a clear distinction in my mind between 2013 and 2023. My answer to the question, do you remember September 2023, would be the same as what I would say about my wedding. Like, I don't remember enough of it. Like, I probably should remember more than I do, babe. My point is, something about entering January makes me realize that I went into a coma sometime mid-November, and I'm like just waking up like, where have I been? What am I? Like, okay, that's what happens to me. And I don't know if you experienced that, but I hit January, and it makes me realize that my whole life has been a blur. I'm telling you this. Why? Because even though I can barely remember the month of September, we've just been talking about the fact that in September, some important things happened for us here as a church. I want us to try to see if we can go back to that time frame, because here on Sunday mornings, as we've said, we covered the 9 essentials of discipleship. That was our theme for this year. Maybe you can even remember which essential you picked as the one that you were going to focus on for this year. If you do, bonus points. That's awesome. That's an impressive accomplishment. But the reason we went over all 9 of these essentials in detail is that our emphasis, again, is discipleship. We want to become more like Jesus. That's the main focus. And so I know we've been in the holiday coma, but it's time to wake up and stretch the arms. We got to roll our shoulders a bit and start pushing back into this goal together as a church family. And so in order to do that, today, we're going to begin a series where we just re-preach all 9 of the essentials. No, I'm just kidding. Some of you are like, no, please, no. Believe me, I don't want to do it either, okay? No, that's not what we're going to do. We're going to introduce you to a new plan here for the next couple of months, and I want to do that as we get started this morning. Again, discipleship, what is it? Discipleship is all about becoming more like Jesus. A disciple, as we know, is someone who follows Jesus, is being changed by Jesus, and is on mission with Jesus. That's what a disciple is, and we want to become more like Jesus. But we've not talked about this, but there's a major assumption embedded in that whole definition. And the assumption is that you actually know something about Jesus, right? That you can't become more like him if you don't know anything about him. Now, every follower of Jesus knows at least something, but we could all stand to better understand him, how he was, who he was, how he operated, what mattered to him. If we're going to become more like him, we got to learn more about him. You could say it this way: if we want to be like Jesus, we have to know what Jesus was like, right? If we want to be like Jesus, we have to know what Jesus was like. And so in order to do that, we're going to take a deep dive into Jesus, his life, his ministry, his patterns and habits. And in order to do that, we're going to look closely at an authorized biography of Jesus written by a physician in the first century whose name was Luke. There are actually 4 authorized biographies of Jesus. We call them the Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But for the next 6 months or so, we are going to be living in this biography in order to get our minds really entrenched in the ways and the means and the life of Jesus. And Luke's account is a great place for us to start. But hear me out, okay? I just want to make this disclaimer. We're not going to be looking at every single verse in Luke. Our goal isn't necessarily to preach through Luke in those terms. Our goal really is to investigate the life of Jesus and see what his life means for us. So we're going to be going through different chapters, you could call them, chapters of the biography of Jesus, and using different themes to explore what he was like, covering things like what did he teach, or how did he sustain his ministry? How did he train other people in ministry? And so for the month of January, it's going to be all about how he started, his ministry origins. And I'll just say, if you've been paying attention, you actually might notice that we've already been in Luke a decent bit over the last couple of months. We talked about Luke during our Christmas series. Last week, Greg was in the Gospel of Luke as he talked about the importance of being in God's Word and doing chapter a day. So we hope that you get loads of Luke over the next 6 months from all different kinds of angles, okay? The more you're in it, the better. That'll be great for all of us. But in order to set us up for success as we're settling in, I would like to teach us this morning through the prologue, where Luke lays out his purpose, his approach, and I think that should help us frame out our time in the book. Okay, I'm going to cover a lot of background that if you'd like to, you can come back to this message. Don't feel like you have to remember all this in one sitting. That's fine. We're going to just hopefully frame out our time. This could be, you could think of it as your personal introduction to Luke, so that you better understand him as a person better, because he is going to introduce us to Jesus. So really this is about Jesus, but we're spending a week kind of figuring out who Luke is and why he's writing so that we better understand him and his writing. So I'm trying to whet your appetite here. I know this sounds extremely exciting, right? I know. It's almost like if you're about to go on a trip to a cool place, if you're like me, you might end up like watching a couple movies that were filmed in a cool place, or do some research about the history so that when you get there and you're seeing things in person, you're like, oh yeah, and like you can connect the dots. And that's kind of what I want to do for you today. Okay, we're just going to nerd out like tour guide style on Luke. And so I hope that you're ready to roll. If you're the kind of person, by the way, who zones out when the tour guide starts talking at a historical site, first of all, boo. Nerds are people too, okay? So you need to know that. But if you're that kind of person, you have my permission in the next couple of minutes, make up a fake excuse. You can make your way out of the auditorium, just jump out of the chat, let them know you'll see them next week, whatever. Just know I'll be deeply offended and I'll cry a little bit. But no, I'm kidding. I'm not going to notice. I'm way too excited about talking about this. So leave whenever you want. It'll be fine. The rest of us will stay. It'll be great. Let me read the prologue. Just going to break it down a little bit. This is the gospel of Jesus Christ according to Luke. Luke chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. Here's what it says. Now many have undertaken to compile an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, like the accounts passed on to us by those who were eyewitnesses and servants of the word from the beginning. So it seemed good to me as well, because I've followed all these things carefully from the beginning, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know for certain the things you were taught. So much in there, okay? I'm really excited. Let's jump into this. Who is talking here? Who's the author of this prologue? Well, as we've said, the author here is Luke. Even though Luke as a gospel is technically anonymous, it was from very early on as it was being distributed, it was attributed to Luke. It had the authoritative stamp of being from God through Luke. But why him? Okay, why would he be selected? If you think about it, the guy, if you don't know anything about him, I'll just tell you, he's not an apostle. He wasn't a disciple. He wasn't there when this stuff was happening. So why would he get tapped to write this? I think those are good questions. But as it turns out, Luke is a great pick. And here's why, okay? Luke was not an apostle, but he was very closely associated with a little-known guy named Paul, okay? Paul, if you're not familiar with him, wrote 2/3 of the New Testament. He's the most prolific missionary of all time, probably, and he was arguably the most influential leader in the early church. And Luke is very closely associated with him. If you know anything about Paul, you might know about like Timothy or Titus or Barnabas or Silas. These are all people that are closely associated with Paul, and Luke is much like that. He traveled with Paul. He got to know Paul's teaching. He was mentored by him. Paul even mentions him 3 times in his writing. Here's one example from Philemon. He says, Epaphras, my fellow prisoner in Christ Jesus, sends his greetings to you, and so do Mark and Aristarchus and Demas and Luke, my fellow workers. When it comes to Luke, Paul's like, yeah, he's a comrade. This is one of my boys. This is a close co-worker. And then I love this example in 2 Timothy. He says, Luke alone is with me. And this is significant because this is right after Paul has been abandoned by a group of other close friends. So Luke here is like, he's the good one. Luke is the good one who stuck it out. I mean, to me, this alone gives him a ton of credibility. He's got the right mentor, but he's actually also got the right mind. We know this about Luke. In Colossians, Paul calls him the beloved physician. He greets you. The beloved physician. Luke is a student of Paul. He's faithful in the midst of difficulty, and he's a doctor. At a time when much of the world was illiterate, this is a person with formal academic training. He's got a serious mind to do like difficult tasks. So if you had to pick anybody of the original crew to like amass a research project on the person of Jesus and what really happened, Luke would be a great guy to do it. In this culture especially, it would have been important to know his ethnic background, meaning is he a Jew or is he a Gentile? We actually don't know this about him. For a lot of people, they've assumed that he's a Gentile. I'm not personally as convinced of that as some people are. But actually, big picture, in his case, it doesn't really seem to matter because what his writing shows is that he's very good at both grasping and then also articulating all the little cultural nuances in a way that get all the details right and are understandable to both Jews and to Gentiles. So here's a guy. He's mentored by Paul, a physician, likely the smartest guy in the room in a lot of rooms that he's in. He's good with cultural nuance. He's a great pick for this project. So what does he produce? Let's talk about it. Well, when we think of the Gospel of Luke, what we're really thinking of is actually just volume 1 of an extensive research project into the life and impact of Jesus of Nazareth. Really, volume 1 is the Gospel according to Luke. And in this volume, he discusses the birth, ministry, death, and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. He pulls that all together from the existing written material, from oral tradition, interviews with people like Paul who were there or were instructed by Jesus. And he put it all together very carefully to give a detailed report of the facts. But again, this is actually just volume 1. Because after he was done with that, he turned his attention to the lasting impact, to the ripple effect. When Jesus had returned to heaven, he released his apostles to continue the mission, to continue making disciples. And he wrote about that as well. We call that volume 2. That's the Acts of the Apostles. You may or may not have realized, Luke and Acts is really, it should be considered a joint work. Volume 2 is about Jesus and his impact on the world. Actually, if you look at the first couple verses of Acts, it'll sound familiar. He says, in the first book, O Theophilus, I have dealt with all that Jesus began to do and teach until the day he was taken up, after he had given commands through the Holy Spirit to the apostles whom he had chosen. That sounds familiar, right? This is clearly the same person outlining the start of a second volume, assuming you've already read volume 1. And honestly, to this day, I wish that the books of the Bible put Luke, Acts right next to each other instead of like sticking John in the middle between them. It would be way clearer to know that they go together. Now, nobody asked me about what order they should be put in, weirdly, but no, it would be, to me, it would be helpful if they were because they really are connected. But notice he says what Jesus began to do and teach. Because, of course, Jesus didn't stop. He continued his work through his apostles and through their actions. By the way, that's why it's called the Acts or the actions of the apostles. Do we get that? Okay. It's okay to admit if you're just now realizing that's why it's called Acts or the Acts of the Apostles. I was like well into adulthood and formal biblical training before I realized that. So if you were today years old when you found out, that's all right. No judgment. That's why it's called Acts. No shame. But Jesus began his work during his life, but it continues to the present. Honestly, to this very place, to this moment in this local church, Jesus is still doing the work. And in volume 2, Luke continued researching the impact of Jesus up until his present time. And it was a super significant undertaking with details and facts, lots of reporting. In fact, at one point, as the gospel is spreading, Luke actually decides to become an embedded reporter of these details. You catch this if you're reading in Acts, if you're reading carefully. In Luke 16, verse 8, he's just reporting. He says, so passing by Mysia, they went down to Troas. But then, just 2 verses later, if you're reading, it says, when Paul had seen the vision, immediately we sought to go into Macedonia. Now he's in the trenches with them. Now he doesn't have to rely on research. He can rely on his eyes. This was all part of the undertaking that he began to compile and lay out the historical impact of Jesus of Nazareth. Okay, if you are still with me, then you are the kind of person who reads the plaques at the historical sites. And may your tribe increase. But what have we said so far? In summary, if you've zoned out, here's what you need to know. Bottom line, if we want to become like Jesus, we need to know what Jesus was like. And in order to do that, we're going to study the work of a man named Luke, who chronicled the life of Jesus. Luke was a doctor. He was mentored by Paul. He used his considerable mental gifts to put to the project of writing a 2-volume account that we can all reliably use by God's grace and by his Spirit to better know and to better understand Jesus, so that we can become more like Jesus. And with all of that in mind, let's look back at Luke chapter 1, verses 1 through 4, and we're going to look now at what these words mean and also what they mean for us. Here we go. Luke 1, we'll start in verses 1 and 2. He said, now many have undertaken to compile an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, like the accounts passed on to us by those who were eyewitnesses and servants of the word from the beginning. What's he talking about here? Well, he's setting the context. He's setting the context about what's already out there in the market about the life of Jesus. As far as we can tell, at least the Gospel of Mark and likely the Gospel of Matthew are already in circulation by the time Luke is writing this. So he's got access to solid written materials and sources. He's likely also got a lot of oral resources he can pull from. And what he's saying kind of in this opening is like, hey, I'm aware of the great work that already exists on this topic. And what is it that these people were writing about? He's saying they were writing of the things that have been fulfilled among us. The accounts that are already in circulation, they're not just personal reflections or collection of interpretations of various events. They are simply a description of the events as they occurred. These are meant to be entered into the historical record. This is not an op-ed. This is news reporting. And that's important to Luke. We'll see why it's so important to him in just a minute. But who's behind these other accounts that he's referencing? He says these are like the accounts that were passed on to us by those who were eyewitnesses and servants of the word from the beginning. Again, he's saying that these were given to us by the people who were there. He's intending to double down on how authentic and how original these sources that he's relying on are. This is important to them. He trusts them as sources because they saw the events. They were there from the beginning. But he also says that they were servants of the word as well. And that's important. Because lots of people were eyewitnesses to Jesus. Jesus did what he did in public, in full view of the watching world. That was like a hallmark of his ministry. But not everyone who saw him believed. In fact, some people saw him and killed him. So what Luke is saying is that the people that he's talking about, look, they saw it, but they also believed it. They followed Jesus in faith. And that's important to Luke as well. And as he's starting here, he's being very technical as he lays out his case and begins this prologue. He's using a writing style, and the wording that he's using, it's very unique in the New Testament. You're not going to see this other places. None of the other biographies of Jesus have an introduction that's so self-aware like this. Luke was actually intentionally employing a style that would have been recognizable to his audience as an introduction of something that was meant to be a legitimate historical description. Okay, he's using a form that they would have known about. It's almost like if a letter that you read begins with something like, to whom it may concern, instead of like, dear mommy, or something like, you can immediately tell the difference in the tone of the letter just by how it's addressed, right? Or if a paper that you're looking at says like, submitted in partial fulfillment for the degree of, like something like that, you know, like, okay, this is like how significant research papers begin. Or in the military, if your email signature is very respectfully versus respectfully, that means something, right? Like, you're noticing these little details to signal your audience about what's going on, the nature of the communication. That's what Luke is doing here. And so what's his end game? What style is he using? What's the goal he's conveying? Well, that's what he gives us. He says, "It seemed good to me as well, because I've followed all of these things carefully from the beginning to write an orderly account." Luke came to the conclusion that he should jump into the fray. He's presenting himself again as also authoritative. He has carefully followed these events. This is not his first time tracking this news story. He didn't just start reading about this. And he says he's going to be orderly in his approach. He's going to do his homework, lay out the information in an intentional way to move the audience toward a particular conclusion. And who's the audience? Who's he trying to compel? He says he was writing an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus. So now we're introduced to the who, the person for whom and to whom Luke is writing. Who is this guy? Who's Theophilus? Well, his name means literally lover of God. Perhaps there's a hint about him in the name. But what we don't know for sure is whether this is his actual real name, his given name, or maybe it's a pseudonym that Luke was using to protect this guy's identity. Because that phrase, most excellent, as sort of an introduction, has some formality. It indicates at least he's wealthy. Perhaps he's even in government leadership. And him exploring this faith system about Jesus, where only Jesus is king and not Caesar, Caesar's not Lord, only Jesus is Lord, this would be dangerous. It could be harmful to a person in politics at the time. His future could be in danger. So it's possible Luke is just using a nickname, an appropriate one, to protect this guy's identity. Or it could just be his real name. We're not really sure. But remember that lover of God doesn't immediately reference Jesus or the God of the Bible. This was a very religious culture, lots of gods. So the God in the case of lover of God could just refer to anything in the Roman pantheon rather than Jesus. But all that to say, Theophilus is not a random recipient. What's likely is that he is the patron of this project. He supplied Luke with the means to do the research, to compile it. That was a common way for that kind of work to get done at the time. Honestly, not unlike today where there are research positions. They're an endowed chair at like a research university, and people have donated money in order to keep this particular position and its work and the lab associated with it or whatever, to keep that afloat. Maybe a similar situation here for Luke with Theophilus. And I'm personally convinced, you could come to your own conclusion, but I'm convinced that Theophilus was not quite convinced yet about Jesus. And I get that from the next sentence. I think it implies that Theophilus is someone that we might think of as seeking. He's not sure yet what he believes. He has started the 30-day trial, but he's okay with sending it back at the end if he needs to, type thing. He needs the facts laid out. And I get that sense from Luke's purpose statement. He's writing to you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know for certain the things you were taught. You may know for certain. Luke is unapologetic about his goal. He is going to lay out the facts from authoritative sources. He's going to put them down into an orderly account for the purpose of providing certainty for his patron. Certainty that what he had heard is facts. It's not fake news. He's heard it, but he's not yet certain, and Luke would like him to be. Because here's the thing. The movement that we today call Christianity, it's not a movement based on pious nothings or on brainless faith. Okay, part of having certainty is the employment of facts and figures and logic and history. Luke is a man of science, and he wanted his approach to be reflective of his training. He would not be satisfied with rumors and unfalsifiable speculation. This is a guy who was serious about his work. He was laying out objective conclusions, and he wanted objective conclusions to be drawn from what he had put together. As you read through Luke, and I encourage you to do that, you're going to see a whole bunch of stuff like dates and times and places and specific governors and the delineation of the borders of particular people's influence and authority and towns and that kind of stuff. Lots of details that anyone in that time, or frankly, anyone in this time, could validate as either historically true or false. If Luke were in the business of trying to propagate a myth, including a bunch of details like who's the high priest and what their kids' names are, and that Quirinius was the governor of Syria, and this was the first time that he did a registration of the course of his leadership, that would be really dumb if you're trying to perpetuate a myth. A better way to do it would be to base his story a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, right? That doesn't encourage any further exploration. It's just like a thing that happened somewhere. But he's not trying to avoid scrutiny. He roots his account in details that he's inviting Theophilus to check out for himself. And so what follows is the rest of Luke Acts, and it's the single longest and largest contribution to the New Testament. A logical, historical, detailed accounting of the life of Jesus of Nazareth and the implications of his teaching and his living. Luke laid it out for the world to see and then for the world to decide. Is this Jesus worthy of giving my life to? So let me ask us, or ask you, who are you in this introduction? Who are you in this introduction? First, I'd ask, are you Luke? Are you Luke? Are you following Jesus and committed to the growth and the confident faith of other people? That's great. We've got a lot of people in our church family like this. I love that heart, a heart to lay out an orderly account so that other people could be convinced. And for some of you, this looks like taking classes and like sharpening your logic and historical, prowess and knowing different philosophical arguments and trying to piece it together so that you can, articulate your faith in a way that could be compelling to other people. For some, it just looks like living your life in front of Jesus. Your life with Jesus in front of others so that they see that the impact that Jesus has on your life is to produce people who are kind and compassionate, who tell the truth, who love justice, who love people deeply around them, whoever crosses their path. And that's a way to lay out an orderly account of the impact of Jesus. And I love that Luke, what's beautiful about this whole thing is that he's using his research and he's putting it out into circulation, arranging the facts just so that it would be most compelling to a very specific audience, a person that he felt he was best situated to reach. He had to write Luke, even though Matthew and Mark already existed, because he wanted Theophilus to hear it from him in this way. In many ways, that's what each of us get to do with those in our life who don't yet know Jesus. You're the best person to depend on God's Spirit to craft the right words at the right moments that would be most compelling to their particular heart and situation. The expression of the gospel is not a mass-produced thing for everyone. It is often a custom-arranged message that fits particular people that God has called us to reach. And he gives us the ability to do that. That was Luke's calling. That's what he did, and that's our invitation from him. So in this introduction, are you Luke? Or perhaps you're Theophilus. Perhaps you're Theophilus. You ask a lot of questions. That's great. God, in some generic form, is part of your life, has a place in your life, or maybe he, she, it did at one point. And you can't seem to get past the question, who is Jesus? What has he done, and why does it matter? Is this all real? Is this all contrived? Is this just a crutch? I don't really know for sure. You don't know for sure whether Jesus and his impact on the world has been good or bad, or how it is that you're supposed to square kind of the goodness that Jesus seems to emanate with all the bad that some of his followers have perpetuated over time and what they've said and done throughout history, and I get that. Those are good questions and objections. But for some people, maybe it's a little less logical. And it's a little more practical because following Jesus, you sense, would mean leaving behind self-reliance. And things are going pretty good. I don't know that I need a different person driving. I kind of like how my life goes when I'm in charge. Giving up control is scary. I get that. Jesus will inevitably require that of you, so understand your hesitation. If you're a Theophilus, I want you to know we're really glad that you're exploring. Glad you're exploring. Luke wrote this book just for someone like you. He did. So please allow this family called Bay Area to be a place for you to explore and to ask your hard questions. We are not scared of any of them. We don't have answers necessarily for them, but we know where to look. We'd be happy to walk with you. Honored. But maybe for you, you're like, honestly, okay, it's not that clean. I'm not Luke. I'm not Theophilus. I'm neither. I don't fit either category. That's fine. The heart of really what I'm asking here is, do you have certainty about Jesus? Do you have certainty about Jesus? That's a hard question. It's a hard question for me. But if you'd say, look, as much as I'm certain about anything, and I'm not even sure that I know how to define certainty in the life that we're living in, but as much as I can have certainty about anything, I have certainty about Jesus. If that's you, here's what I think you need to do. I think you need to read on. You need to read on. Keep reinforcing your confidence in who Jesus is by taking in his life and then modeling your life after his. Nothing helps a person become more like Christ than seeing Christ in action. Immerse your life in his life. That's why we talk so much about being word-centered, word-saturated. Read on. Read on in Luke to increase your confidence and your certainty and become more like him. But if your answer to that question, you certain about Jesus, is no. No, I'm not certain. Or I don't think I'm certain, which is the same as not having it, right? Here's what I think you need to do. You need to read on. You need to read on. Again, Luke wrote this for you. Will you take up the task of tracking with a great mind and researcher and come to a conclusion about Jesus? Look, no one is asking you to believe in something that lives in the fairy tale world. These are real historical claims made in an actual time and place. So I'm inviting you to explore them because that's what it invites you to do, is determine whether or not you believe this is an accurate recounting of the events of history and what that might mean for your life today. And I gotta be honest, I'm excited about this series, if you can't tell. I'm excited to explore the life of Jesus through the lens of Luke. And I'm inviting all of us to join in as we hopefully together are becoming more like Jesus, and we find out over the course of the next few months how Jesus started his ministry, how he sustained it, how he taught other people, how he trained them, how he lived his life among the people who were in front of him. And hopefully, together, we can become more like him. Let me pray. Father, thank you for the gifts that you gave Luke, such that he could do the research and put it all together in a way that your Holy Spirit would work through him to ensure that every word was what you wanted us to have. And thank you that we now know that we can have an accurate recounting of what occurred with this Jesus, your son. And I pray that our lives would better reflect him as we explore your word. And for those who are uncertain, thank you that you walk patiently with all of us, and that none of us have this nailed down, and we're simply depending on you, your Spirit, and your grace to know you a little better and to become more like you every day. We pray this in the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen. Hey, thanks for being here. We will see you guys next week. It's that boring. I don't want you for a whole 365 days. Now, we'll see you guys next week. Stay healthy.